how unspoken childhood shape adult realities. There's a kind of childhood that doesn't look broken from the outside. There are no dramatic events, no catastrophes, no scenes that would make a movie. It's quiet, it's clean, it's silent. And that silence is the very thing that screams the loudest, but only when you grow up. If you had a silent childhood, you probably didn't even know it was a problem. You were the easy kid. You didn't cause trouble. You entertained yourself. You didn't complain. You didn't cry too much. You were praised for your independence, your maturity, your ability to handle things on your own. But here's the philosophical paradox. What if the very things you were praised for were actually protective mechanisms you developed in the absence of emotional safety? Let's take this deeper. Imagine growing up in a household where emotions weren't punished, but they weren't welcomed either. Maybe your parents weren't abusive. Maybe they were even kind, predictable, stable. But they were distant, or distracted, or emotionally unavailable. So you adapted. You learned not to need too much. You learned to suppress your questions, your fears, your disappointments, because there was nowhere for them to go. And over time, you became fluent in silence. You stopped asking, stopped expecting, stopped reaching. This is the invisible trauma, the trauma of what didn't happen. No one yelled, no one hit, but no one really saw you either. Your inner world, your wonder, your confusion, your pain was never mirrored back to you. And that's where the loudest inner pain begins, in the gap between what you felt and what was acknowledged. That's not just psychological neglect, that's philosophical fragmentation. Because when your inner reality is never reflected by the outer world, you eventually start to question whether your inner world even matters.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let me ask you something that might change how you see your entire life. What parts of yourself did you silence just to stay emotionally safe? Think about that. Not what was taken from you, but what you withdrew voluntarily, your voice, your curiosity, your vulnerability. You didn't bury those things because you were weak. You buried them because you were wise. You intuited, at a young age, that being emotionally visible might not be safe. So you disappeared yourself. And no one noticed, because you did it so well. This is where the pain turns inward. When you grow up in emotional silence, you don't stop feeling. You just stop expressing. And unexpressed emotion doesn't vanish. It accumulates. It becomes tension in the chest, tightness in the jaw, overthinking, low-grade anxiety, chronic self-doubt, an inability to trust your instincts, a constant scanning of other people's moods. You develop an internal radar, always trying to anticipate needs, avoid conflict, and stay one step ahead of disappointment. That's not just emotional behavior. That's a philosophical survival strategy. You've unconsciously decided, being who I am is less important than keeping things peaceful. But here's the twist. Eventually, that peace becomes its own prison. You become so good at not needing anything that no one offers you anything. You become so used to not being asked how you feel that you stop even knowing. And when you hit adulthood, this emotional silence turns into existential noise. You feel empty, but you don't know why. You crave connection, but you struggle to open up. You long for intimacy, but vulnerability feels foreign. And so you perform, you achieve, you succeed. But beneath the surface, you carry an ancient ache. Why didn't anyone ever ask who I really was? This is where philosophy meets psychology. Because the silent childhood doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes ontology. It shapes your very sense of being. You start to believe that your value is tied to your utility, that your worth is based on how little space you take up, that your primary role in life is to accommodate others, not to express yourself. And that belief system doesn't just limit your relationships, it limits your existence. You become a ghost in your own life, silently screaming for permission to be fully human. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine a cat that grows up in a home where no one ever abuses it, but no one ever pets it either. It's fed, it's safe, it's warm, but it's never held, never mirrored, never felt. That cat may appear calm on the outside, but inside, it never learned how to connect. And here's the question: is safety enough without connection? Is survival enough without being seen? The child who grows up in silence becomes the adult who doubts their right to speak. And here's where it gets even more painful. When that adult finally tries to express themselves, they often feel guilt, because for so long, silence was their shield. And speaking feels like betrayal. Betrayal of the family that wasn't that bad. Betrayal of the identity they built around being the strong one. Betrayal of the version of themselves that was praised for not needing anything. So they pull back, again, silently. But this time, it hurts more, because now they know they're suppressing themselves. Now they feel the weight of inauthenticity. And that's the loudest inner pain of all. Not just not being seen, but actively hiding who you are, even from yourself. So what do we do with this? How do we begin to heal from a silence that became our native language? First, we name it. We stop minimizing it. We stop saying, well, at least I wasn't abused, or other people had it worse. That kind of comparative suffering is a trap. Pain is pain. And emotional invisibility is a wound. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be damaging. It just needs to be unacknowledged. And when we finally acknowledge it, when we look our silent childhood in the face and say, that mattered, that shaped me, we begin to reclaim the voice that was buried. Second, we reconnect with the self we silenced, the part of us that once reached out, the part that asked questions, that wanted to be held, that had messy feelings and inconvenient needs. That part is still inside us, and it's not weak, it's human. And the more we make space for it, the more we begin to recover something deeper than healing. We recover our wholeness. Third, we learn to speak, not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. We practice saying how we feel, even when it feels clumsy. We practice asking for what we need, even when it feels risky. Because every time we speak from the place that was once silenced, we break the spell of our childhood. We rewrite the story. We become the parent, the friend, the partner, the philosopher that our younger self longed for. And finally, we forgive. Not to excuse, but to evolve. We forgive the people who couldn't see us, not because they were right, but because holding on to anger keeps us tethered to silence. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's releasing. It's saying, you didn't see me, and that hurt, but I see me now, and I'm not going to hide anymore. Emotional echoes, how unspoken childhood shape adult realities when you've been shaped by a silent childhood. Adulthood becomes a constant negotiation between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. You might be in a relationship, a career, even a circle of friends, and still feel like you're performing. You smile, you listen, you show up. But inside there's a voice that whispers, will anyone ever ask how I'm really doing? And when they don't, you don't blame them. You blame yourself for wanting more, for feeling too much, for not being content with surface-level connection. That's the emotional echo of growing up unheard. You keep silencing yourself even when the world isn't asking you to anymore. One of the most painful outcomes of this internalized silence is the way it distorts your self-perception. You begin to see yourself as too sensitive, too needy, or too intense, not because you actually are, but because your emotional needs were never mirrored back to you with compassion. In that vacuum of reflection, your feelings began to feel wrong by default. So now, as an adult, even when someone does offer empathy, you might push it away. You might feel undeserving of care or suspicious of kindness. Because when you've spent years adapting to emotional invisibility, visibility feels foreign, sometimes even threatening. Another echo appears in your boundaries, or the lack of them. If you weren't allowed to express anger, fear, or sadness in your early years, you likely learned to suppress those signals. But emotions are messengers. They alert us to danger, to unmet needs, to injustice. When we mute them, we also mute our internal compass. And so in adulthood, we find ourselves saying yes when we mean no, staying in places that drain us, and tolerating behaviors that feel wrong. Not because we don't know better, but because our emotional GPS was never programmed. We were trained to prioritize peace over truth, harmony over honesty. And that training doesn't vanish, it echoes. Let me ask you something that might challenge everything you believe about your personality. How much of who you think you are is actually just who you had to become to survive emotional silence? That question isn't meant to unravel your identity. It's meant to help you rebuild it. Because once you realize that your strength was often just adaptation and your independence was often just self-abandonment, you can begin to reclaim the parts of you that were left behind. You can start to differentiate between your true self and your coping self. And that is one of the most profound acts of personal liberation. This journey isn't about blame. It's about awareness. It's about realizing that the people who raised you may have done their best, but that doesn't mean their best met your emotional needs. Many of them were raised in silence themselves. They didn't know how to name feelings. They didn't know how to hold space. They taught you what they were taught, that emotions are inconvenient, that vulnerability is weakness, that self-sufficiency is the highest virtue. And while that may have helped you survive, it also kept you from fully living. Because being alive isn't just about functioning, it's about feeling. Once you begin to reconnect with your emotional self, something extraordinary happens. You stop fearing your depth. You stop apologizing for your needs. You stop settling for relationships where you feel like a therapist instead of a partner. You start surrounding yourself with people who don't just tolerate your feelings, they respect them. And in doing so, you begin to rewrite the emotional blueprint of your life. You start living from the inside out, instead of constantly editing yourself to fit into someone else's comfort zone. That's when healing becomes transformation. But here's the final philosophical twist. The pain of your silent childhood is not just a source of suffering, it's a source of wisdom. Because having lived without emotional language, you now value it more than most. You've developed a sensitivity to nuance, a reverence for authenticity, and a commitment to understanding others at a depth they may not even understand themselves. That's not a weakness, that's a superpower. And when you combine that sensitivity with self-awareness, you become a force of healing not just for yourself, but for others. You become a force of healing not just for yourself, but for others. You become the kind of person who listens in a way that makes others feel seen. You become the kind of presence that makes silence safe again, not because it holds it. The gift beneath the wound, how inner silence can become a well of wisdom when we finally stop running from the silence of our childhood. Something unexpected happens. We begin to hear what's inside of it. Not just the pain, not just the echoes of unmet needs, but something quieter and maybe even more powerful. We begin to hear ourselves. Beneath the years of suppression is a voice that never truly died. It just waited for the moment we were ready to stop surviving and start listening. That voice isn't bitter. It isn't angry. It's patient. It's tender. And it carries something sacred, the truth of who we've always been. This is where the wound becomes the gift. Because when you've walked through emotional silence, you learn to listen more deeply, not just to others, but to life itself. You become attuned to subtlety, to nuance, to the things people don't say but desperately want to be understood. That sensitivity, once a burden, becomes your wisdom. It allows you to read between the lines, to hold space for others in a way that feels like oxygen. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches you how to hold space for yourself. You begin to realize that your needs were never too much. They were just unmet. And now, finally, you are the one who can meet them. This kind of wisdom doesn't come from books. It comes from being, from enduring the void and coming out the other side with your heart still intact. From learning that silence can be a prison, but it can also be a monastery, a place where you meet your truest self, stripped of performance, free of noise. And when you meet that self, you realize something staggering. You've always been enough. Not because you're perfect, not because you never needed anyone, but because your worth was never dependent on being understood. It was always intrinsic, always there, even in the silence. Let me ask you a final question, one that might take you the rest of your life to answer. What would your life look like if you lived from your wholeness instead of your wounds? What if your strength didn't come from how well you hide your pain, but from how courageously you share your truth? What if your softness wasn't a liability, but a form of sacred power? What if the silence that once hurt you could now guide you into deeper relationships, more meaningful work, and a life that feels not just full, but true? That is the gift beneath the wound. That is the alchemy of philosophy and pain. When we stop fearing the silence, we reclaim the wisdom it has been holding for us all along. And in doing so, we don't just heal, we awaken. We become the kind of person who no longer needs to be loud to be heard. Because now, finally, we are listening to ourselves. And that changes everything.